So for those of you whom I know, hello. And for those of you I've not met, hello, I'm Kirsten. And standing on a stage to talk about things sets an interesting scene. It certainly ups the ante. So when I discovered that this was going to be on a stage, I decided, okay, then it's time to up the ante. So Rob and I are going to do this opening in tandem. And so I've made choices and he's made choices that are part of how we set a scene. And I might, the opening part of this will be me and then Rob. I think in agreement with Stephanie, we're going to keep questions to the next couple of days when we are together. So this is expect a situation where you are listening for a bit. And I chose to make, I've made a deliberate choice to do something that I don't very often do. So my presentation is going to be in two parts. And I ask now for forgiveness that the first part is what we know, but it is leveraging perhaps the magpie nature of somebody who works in an organization that has its fingers in many, many different contexts and places of the world. And so I gather as a magpie pieces of information. So what I chose to do was put together those pieces of information into one collective whole. And that is very much a whole responding to a situation of a world beyond 1.5. And the second part of what I want to talk about is think of it as acupuncture points, ways of thinking about pressure points in this system. But mostly what I wanted to do was create a frame for the time that we spend together, looking at the question of resilience. Because I think now, in this year, after the 6 months that we've had, really taking stock of what we are facing and what we are engaging with and what resilience means in that context starts to be extraordinarily important. And our pressure points and the way we design and the way we think is going to have to really level up to the order and the scale of the problem and its dimensions. So my forgiveness is for setting the tone, at least for the first part, for a set of reflections that are dark. So I want to start with the scene setting on a number of different dimensions. Firstly, that we are, in fact, already beyond 1.5 degrees, and that Europe, of all places, in this remarkable picture postcard, perfect Switzerland on a way too hot June, already the fastest warming continent. And that means that we are dealing with a circumstance which requires us to understand this kind of shape. And I will come back to this shape because my request to all of us as we think about the time we spend together is how to imagine designing for that shape of change. And change not only with respect to decarbonization, but also change with respect to resilience and adaptation. That shape of change is nothing that we have experienced in our collective lifetimes, other than in the experience of extreme conflict. And here we are called as designers, as makers and shapers of that shape of change. So the pieces of the puzzle that I wanted to put together, where we are right now puts us at a scenario that is significantly worse than where we are now. 2 degrees by 2040, 3 degrees by the end of the century. The 2 degrees by 2040 is not really alterable anymore. There are too many lock-ins, there are too many feedback loops, so we are actually at 2 degrees by 2040. 3 degrees by the end of the century depends very much on our capacity to work with that shape. But 2 degrees by 2040 requires us to change fairly fundamentally our understanding of what is at stake. Then we know that we are not only dealing with the question of warming and everything that comes with it. We have planetary boundaries, many of which are already well beyond in transgression. And you may have seen the work that Johan Rockström launched in Davos this year to create a kind of global planetary health check so that we start to literally feed in from across the entire ecological planetary system our understanding of what that looks like. But more problematically, we are beginning to notice that the natural order of systems that absorb carbon, excess carbon, are no longer functioning the way they have been functioning for decades or for centuries. So this piece of news coming out last year starts to really alter things, because we currently have a significant amount, I think it's something like 80% of carbon dioxide emissions are absorbed by nature. The minute that nature stops absorbing that, we are in an exponentially greater uptick of warming than we have so far modeled, which means we are now finally actually having conversations that are no longer around the theory of what happens if the North Atlantic Oscillation transforms, but beginning to comprehend the need to model what that does, not if, but when and how, and what do we understand about it. We know from several years back, this was a picture that the UN put together, this is a copy of it, of what happens at 4 degrees. And on this map, you see the green areas are areas that are capable of producing food. Look at where they are. And look at what is happening in the world right now, where those areas are. The yellow areas are uninhabitable. They are being used for solar energy array. The UN's assumption when this image was produced was that the green areas would need to be ring-fenced as global food commons in order to allow humanity, in whatever population size, to survive. So we are looking at something that begins to have us understand, what does 2 degrees by 2040 look like? What does 3 degrees by the end of the century possibly look like? And the reason why I'm coming back to that is not to act as a doomsday, it's to ask us, are we designing for this? Because when I see what comes over my desk in the proposals for building infrastructure, for transport, for cooling, it is not designed for this. It is designed for something relevant to the last 50 years. And we are not in the last 50 years. So I wanted to then bring out, what are those pieces of that puzzle? What do we need to understand that we are designing for? Heat. And in particular when it comes to cities. And we know in particular that resource-strapped cities in the global majority, cities where there are extremes of exposure, where there are extremes of infrastructure challenges, are most effective. We also know, I don't know whether you know, 45 degrees centigrade, most air conditioners collapse. If they're required to run sustained at 45 degrees of ambient temperature for a long time, they crash. We haven't designed air conditioners for the world in which we're living. Heat, water. The Greenland ice sheet pretty much now is gone. It's not refreezing sufficiently fast, which means that if you take the work of David King, that translates into 6 meters of sea level rise. 6 meters of sea level rise takes out at least one of the major food baskets across the world, starting with, say, Vietnam and Indonesia. So rice. We have 3 staple crops, rice, maize, and wheat, that sustain human civilization. Broadly, the majority. 6 meters of sea level rise changes an awful lot. Are we designing for this? We haven't really thought about what happens when we start to lose one or more of those crops. There is a research unit in Mexico called CIMMYT, which researches crop diseases. 5 years ago, they were only 6 months ahead of crop diseases that are climate change driven. So they are mutating seed so that it resists diseases coming through that are climate change intensified. And that window of 6 months is getting now really close to 1 month. The problem being that then that means they just are not in time to stop one or more major breadbasket crop going. I will go a little bit darker. The work of Jacqueline McGlade. So again, I'm collecting pieces of information. The work of Jacqueline McGlade, the multi-year studies that she did on the relationship between the formation of the human brain and systematic malnutrition. If you are malnourished, or at least what her research showed, that if you are malnourished between the ages of 0 and 12, in a sustained way, the human brain doesn't grow the part of the human brain, the hippocamp, that connects the 2 lobes. It's the part of our brains responsible for affiliative responses, responses that mean that when we encounter crisis or tension, we tend to bond together to survive. And she correlated that then with the decades in which the so-called African uprisings, with guys running around in submachine guns and jeeps, so-called democracy uprising, and she said, no, this, if you start to play it through, is the reactions of people who do not have an affiliative response physically in their ways of being able to respond. If you come back to where we are in terms of numbers and temperature, one of the things we should probably be investing the most in is basic nutrition. Universal basic dividend, universal basic meals, so that we have enough of our own hardware capable of staying stable enough, capable of teaming up and looking after ourselves in a mode of solidarity. We know that the other problem of this, the less dramatic alternative, is that higher levels of carbon dioxide in plants, in theory, should create higher levels of photosynthesis and therefore, in theory, more productive plants. Unfortunately, no, higher levels of carbon dioxide triggers plants into creating and storing higher levels of sugar, not that dissimilar to what happens to human bodies. What that means is that we are creating plants that are effectively becoming junk food. Those three staple crops have higher and higher level sugars. That affects our human health in many, many ways, diabetes, obesity, and so on. We know that we have a number of extreme changes in disease, in the movement of species, of insects, of diseases that are traveling around the world and are shifting as a result of this. And most of the work being done on resilience is not really pulling together the entire fields of nutrition, mental health, physical health, diets, disease, the ways in which we think about responses, drug responses, genetic or chemically produced responses, resiliency to infrastructure and so on. That whole nexus area, Stephanie talked about nodes and complex systems. We haven't really started to pull this together as a set of nexus areas that we need to bring together. This is Valencia. Valencia is going to cost northwards of 10 billion, one town in 1 year. This is up the road. We are now also needing to think about the stability of the financial system that we're in. If you start to have in countries across the world more than one Valencia incident every single year, we run out of fiscal room. We simply don't have the money to repair it. And so we are starting to think about, or we need to start thinking about, what does it look like when we begin to notice the correlation of multiple events, and what are they, where are they? More importantly, what do they start to do to the one most structural element that human societies have come up with historically over years to protect themselves and to create a societal bastion? Insurance. Whether it's high-end financial, hardcore, stock market level insurance, or it's mutual insurance of people coming together and putting money into a pot to help each other out when things are difficult, the whole spectrum, it is our historically most effective technology, financial technology, for ensuring some form of stability and of the possibility that things can progress and not collapse. And this is beginning to be a huge problem, because we are starting to see what we knew might happen, but is beginning to happen much harder, and that is that there is this narrow window between the predictability of risks and the price of paying for insurance. It's called the window of insurability. The minute that that begins to collapse, you could potentially insure, but no one can afford to pay it. So I come from Australia. If you look at the cost of insurance north of Sydney, once you start getting up into Queensland, it costs you between $200,000 and $300,000 a year to insure your house, which nobody pays, so there is no insurance. So the taxpayer pays, and if the taxpayer is paying for everything, then we start to run out of money. And insurance underwrites the entire financial system. If you can't get insurance, you can't get a loan, you can't get credit. Once insurance comes out of the bottom of our entire financial system, everything collapses. Again, I will be in London next week for London Climate Action Week. Bringing insurance, all of these pieces together, is only just beginning to happen. That shape of change that I showed you, that needs to move way faster, and these things need to converge. So if you add all of that up, we have people who are needing to move from places that are no longer safe, without food, and in situations at orders of magnitude greater than we have ever managed. We have never managed more than about 100 million people at any point in time in the world, and never in single concentrations. So dealing with the order of displacement means that we also need to start thinking about what happens in social system tipping points. And I would argue that in many ways what we've lived through for the first 6 months of this year is beginning to pattern into exactly that. Really large order tipping points in social systems, in political systems, in economic systems. The challenge is that it shuts down our window of resilience. If you compare insurability to resilience and adaptation responses, what I'm describing is a shrinking window where not just the time is running out, but the space to come up with effective solutions that can actually create or sustain prosperous, beautiful, just, resilient places. So we begin to be in a situation where you have a series of derailment risks, of kind of basically chains of events, cascading and knocking like a dominoes, going one after the other. And the reason, again, why I know that this, as I keep putting up one disaster after another, my one ask is, are we designing for this? Because we need to design for this. And we need to design to what's happening right now. And in particular, we need to design for the way in which what is happening right now is normalizing the idea that your response is violent, your response is aggressive to others, that somehow force majeure collateral damage is forgivable in the name of something, some larger order system. And that leads me to, in French and Italian, the coup de foudre, the most uncomfortable thing that and the reason why I am standing here choosing to give this presentation rather than other things that I might otherwise choose to say. This is Umberto Eco, writing in the 1930s about fascism. I'm going to swap the image. The text remains the same. And many of the things that were there are very, very similar, including the insistence on making everything simple, on cutting out all of the complexity, the complicatedness, the nuance, words with more syllables than Vegemite, anything that requires you to stop thinking or to stop feeling challenged by something uncomfortable and different, to simplify, to reduce, to cut down to memes that make it possible to trade in memes. Now, I want to introduce a couple of elements with the next 3 slides that come from something that happened to me 1 month ago, which again, now that I have done my homework and a bit more research, I probably should have been better prepared for, since it's all in the public domain. But I was sitting in a room a month ago listening to a billionaire who was in a room of billionaires, was a room of Europe's largest tech founders, listening to a billionaire who described himself from the beginning as saying, I'm in business with the Trump family, I'm a close friend of Scott Bessent, I'm in and out of Washington all the time, I know these people, I rate them, I consider this to be one of the smartest US administrations that the US has had for decades, and I'm happy to explain what they're planning to do. And he did explain what they're planning to do, and I registered several things from that. One is that most of what we are currently tangled up about, worried about, and paralyzed about is a smokescreen. Secondly, that a large part of what is afoot has less to do with this man and much more to do with this man, and has a hell of a lot more to do, in fact, with the 2 men who are behind this man and what he had to say in Munich and why he had to say that in Munich, which are Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, and in particular this thing that I've highlighted here. What the essence of what I listened to was an account of a decision to, and I'm going to quote now, to ensure that at this point in history, which is, quote unquote, the last moment in history for the Occident to assert its supremacy over the world and to dominate, which is a domination play focused exclusively on data and on AI, on the control of data and on the control of artificial general intelligence. And for that to happen, the US, the Occident, and Europe with it, hence this particular speech, needs to stop the dilution of blood with respect to Islam and China. Low and quote unquote, low-level immigrant people are not going to win the war of AI, and we have to win this war now in the next 10 years because everything else is irrelevant. Once we've won that war, we solve for climate, we solve for everything else. One of the things that I remember really then kind of doing my homework to understand, okay, yes, I've been reading myself about everything to do with teal, civilization wars, AI, and so on. But this degree of organized moves over multiple decades, this degree of putting yourself in power in a sequence and in a way, this degree of raising up enough dust and enough powder, enough chaos to ensure that most of the world is locked into a paralysis around that while you can get on with ripping out all the checks and balances that give you access to the resources you need. What is that really doing? What is its interpretation of humanity? And then starting to look at people who are beginning to play out. So what does that do? How does this happen? I'm putting this up as a reference simply to take a look at it. So I want to come to the question then of cities and urban resilience and the topic of this forum. It is not a coincidence that the US administration is doing a deal with Saudi Arabia. If you don't know this, it's the Line. It's the big project of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, called the NEOM project, as one of the ways in which you think about an urban future in a technocratic, tech-dominated humanity, not as 8 billion people, but humanity as the human-enhanced, augmented extract of humanity that is wired into and capable of controlling through an Occidental world. And its counterpoint is this: massive UN cities, tent cities, refugee cities. If you think about red pill, blue pill, which one do you want? The question that I wanted to open this forum with is, how do we steer out of this default future? How do we accept that some things here are on a path dependency that are really very, very well prepared, that are actually playing out despite our best intentions? How do we acknowledge that right now we are in some iterative repeat of the 1930s, looking at this and thinking, come on, okay, the world has been full of crazies for years, for decades, for centuries. It can't be that bad. And looking at that and thinking, what if it actually is playing out in that way? How do we design? What do we do? What do we do with these 2 days? So that what we come out of here is not yet another conversation, well-intentioned, good-willed, with lots of good ideas, that is still fundamentally naive. How do we actually design for this? Quickly, together, now, in ways that are extremely resilient, and not just infrastructurally resilient, not just temperature resilient, not just food resilient, but deeply, fundamentally, civilizationally, socially resilient. So, here are my acupuncture points, and then you will have the relief of listening to Rob, who's going to pick us up and take us to a place that is emotionally in a totally different area. Never let a good crisis go to waste. So, acupuncture points to play with. If there's one thing you could say about the situation we are in, it is one of extraordinary uncertainty. And I'm describing a set of magpie collected information, data points, scientific elements to put them into one big systems picture. But if there's one thing that connects them, it is extreme nonlinearity. In a situation of radical uncertainty, and I deliberately thought if we're going to start with a warm data lab from Nora Bateson, then let's go to Nora Bateson's father, Gregory Bateson, the inventor of cybernetics in many ways, the kind of author of so much of our ways of thinking to put ecological thinking, digital thinking, and the human mind together. If there's one thing that Gregory Bateson kept talking about when it comes to extreme uncertainty and the need to face into a future that you want to be able to shape, that you do not want to set on a path, a normative path of we just have to implement these solutions and we'll be fine. You want to keep it agile because you know it's a deeply complex adaptive world. Then you need what he called a budget of possibilities. Multiple possible options, multiple possibilities that you are playing with all of the time. So when we design, We need to be careful not to design for the one thing we think is the answer, but the hundreds of things that just might get us into that curve. Which means we're going to need to think biologically, ecologically. Biomimicry needs to get off academic shelves, off niche corners, off small subcategories of subcategories, and into an absolute mainstream of how we do everything. Which means we also need to start thinking of tipping points not only as negative tipping and feedback loops, but what are the ways in which we design for and with complex adaptive behaviours, financial behaviours, institutional behaviours, legal behaviours, organizational behaviours. We will need to actually learn how to design for something we don't control at all. Structures. We know that one of the biggest single challenges we have is that no matter what we try, how we try it, in where we try it, it is entangled in an existing capital structure that assumes a number of things must be, cannot be other than they are, assumes the right to extract, assumes the necessity of profit. I was in a dinner conversation last night about a Swiss bank I won't name, and all of their extraordinary efforts in sustainability, except for this one fundament. But of course our clients have to make a 10 or 20 plus profit, X profit. That's not a thing we can adjust. Well, we need to start adjusting that. We need to really think about how we design for fundamentally different economic incentives, economic values, economic structures, economic equalities, economic distribution. And there are many solutions proposed. None of them is even remotely close to getting mainstream. And I will bring another element in from what I know we'll be discussing in these days. If we're going to do that, then we need a different mythology, a different core narrative for what a good life is based upon. What are not its technical underpinnings, not its economic shapes, but its underpinning epistemology. How do humans think about the human design for life, coded for not abundance, but coded for sufficiency when it comes to resources and abundance when it comes to intelligence? It requires us to think very differently about the way, for example, we do my core business, innovation. This is a place in Australia called Sundrop Farms, which has managed to combine, through a combination of thinking biologically, combining a number of different elements, to end up with 8 different uncorrelated cash flows from something that is inherently resilient and sustainable. But it requires a totally different way of thinking about how we innovate and how we bring our ingenuity to play. Underpinning structures and institutions sits really deep-coded norms. When I did my PhD on medieval and Renaissance cities, one of the things that I went back to was to understand where does the concept of civis come from? It comes from the entanglement, the deep coding of 2 things, walls and laws. Walls for settled people to claim land in the context of nomadic peoples, and laws to own that land and to structure the claiming of land into ownership over time. One of the things we are going to have to look about is how do we go back to, expand to, consider and change our understanding of ownership. The 352 trillion that we have locked up in freehold. I own a house, I own the land it sits on, and therefore I can determine what happens to it in very many ways. Another acupuncture point that would change extraordinarily what we're able to do. And extending some of our own institutional habits and practices to the natural world, starting to think about personhood for mountains and rivers. Again, I'm sure many of you know this. I'm simply collecting together the different acupuncture points, because if we're going to design for that order of change and resilience in the timeframes we're talking about, we're going to need to work every single element of the system simultaneously. That budget of possibilities that I was referring to has to intervene everywhere all at once. There are cities that are already anticipating this. Tuvalu is one of this. The islands that are already buying land, in this case on the Asian steppes, and setting up what will be the civilization of Tuvalu when the island is underwater. There are cities already establishing themselves as charter cities that begin to create new worlds in places. Think about that 4-degree map of the world. Is that one way? Is that one of the pressure points, one of the ways in which we shift our assumptions about what human civilization in settled ways looks like, as opposed to nomadic civilizations, and the way in which we design that? We have a job to be done on jobs. I work in cities, hundreds of cities, and one of the things that we have not yet really fully acknowledged, although we keep talking about it, is the fact that we don't have enough trained people to do almost any of the work that we need. And our institutional understanding of education keeps thinking about one person, one job, one career, a series of jobs, singular jobs. I grew up with Holocaust survivors. I remember one of the things that I was taught as a tiny kid: you get a degree, you must get a degree. It was with this finger. And you will get a trade. Because when the world goes to shit, it's the trade that will keep you alive. And I remember always growing up with this idea of, I need to be multi-happed, I need to have these things. And now I think about that and it starts to really come into its own. How well do we understand the resilience of the human mind? This is Moran Cerf. He runs a sleep lab in Stanford. You go into the sleep lab, you go to sleep, and he reprograms what you see in the world by changing your memories. He reprograms your memory. And your memory pretty much determines what it is when you're in your constant kind of living life, what it is that you assume and what you understand of things. You come out of the sleep lab, you see a different world, depending on what he's reprogrammed. It's being funded by Google, DARPA, and ARPA. It does open up, though, a serious set of questions around brain chemistry. What if we were to run oxytocin through the air conditioners in every COP, in every London Climate Action Week, in every New York Climate Action Week? What if we chemically started to get ourselves to think about affiliation, adaptation, care differently? We may really need to think about that, not leave that off the table. How do we start to understand how humans show up? How do we begin to embrace ways of being? How do we start to change our core capability requirements, our ways of training ourselves, our ways of thinking what we ask of ourselves? This is Italo Calvino's 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, his ways of describing what he thought were dispositions, qualities, capabilities, mindsets that the world would need going forward. We have some of them in the Inner Development Goals brewing, but again, not mainstream, and still sitting in disconnected places. If we're going to talk about resilience, in the greatest concentrations of human population anywhere on the planet in cities, we are going to have to start designing for the situational contexts, the places, the spaces that code us, that shape our behavior, that think about us. We're going to have to start thinking about how we design for humans, with humans, and by humans in those spaces. And that leads me to someone like Leif Edvinsson. He used to be the head of intellectual capital at Skandia. I met him years and years and years ago when I was working in Generali, trying to worry about how do I get insurance, extraordinarily conservative business, to think about changing its idea of innovation. And he had been doing research on the economics of transformation and managerial and change for organizations. And he said, you know what, if you take a Boston matrix, a 2x2, and you basically on one axis you take risk appetite, and the other axis you take age, you get a perfect smile curve. People in their 20s and people in their 60s and 70s have absolutely no problem changing the world. The problem is that every business and every city and every region has people doing decision-making jobs who are sitting at the bottom of that smile curve, who are in their 40s and 50s or 30s, who are living life like this because they've got mortgages and school fees and families to deal with. He said, so if you actually pay for those people to take a 10-year sabbatical, go and get a Harley Davidson, run the Andes, and you put into their jobs that are decision-making with resources, job shares between the 20-somethings and the 60-somethings, then you'll get change. I went off to the board of Generali and said, I have just heard this extraordinary thing, let's do that. It didn't go so well, but it's still sitting with me. And that leads me to this notion, this is what you will all know of theory U, Otto Scharmer, the notion of the soil, the social soil on which we work. And the reason why I wanted to bring that up is it's okay for me to talk about all of these kind of chemical interventions, resiliency, mindsets, frameworks for human development. If we're going to think about changing human consciousness to be able to exist in the worlds that we're facing and designing human consciousness for that world, we're going to have to start thinking about literally the soil in which we grow ourselves. Mental, emotional, institutional, epistemological, the ways in which we understand what are we building in informal communities, formal communities. How are we coding buildings? How are we coding cities? How are we making them into places where this kind of way of knowing the world is embedded in every single way? And that means we need to start coming to the very, very core of our identities, the narratives, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are in relationship to the world. And in particular, that story. The story of being somehow in a position of being, having the right, being able to decide what happens to the world that is not us. That story requires us to fundamentally shift some of the most important, and I know Rob will pick up on this, technology of all time, which are the storytelling, the stories that really move cultures, nations, peoples over decades. But one thing that I would want to bring into that as we think about how are we going to design for resilience is understanding ourselves, understanding what it means to be human with compassion. We will need to create catharsis and grief, create space for grieving, because we are already having to let go of things that we grew up with, that we love, that are attached with nostalgia and wishful thinking and a sense of what really is beautiful in the world. The idea of giving up on eating meat as much as we have, the idea of giving up on the freedom of being in a car on your own, the idea of giving up of living in a space with lots of green around. Maybe we don't need to, maybe we do, but we're certainly going to need to start designing for our own emotional patterns and our emotional needs. And that means capturing our imaginations, really fundamentally capturing our imaginations around choice. Red pill, blue pill, this is Paris. I came across this guy in Change Now, extraordinary, interesting. He has been doing, it's not AI enabled, he's literally been doing photomontage, huge books and installations to help people think about, these are your choices. You have choices, but these choices have outcomes. This is where these choices take you. And I was reminded when I thought back of that, of something that is centuries old. There are plenty of places in the world, and in Europe in particular, where there were large-scale depictions of the choices you were making and enacting on a daily basis. This is Siena in the 1300s, just before the Black Plague. This is Siena painting a picture in a room where governors, all of the decision-making system in Siena sat in audience and had people coming in to petition. This is the picture of a city governed according to common good, with all of the mechanical arts and trades, the countryside in balance, in harmony, and a little figure up there explaining this is what you get if you abide by these kinds of rules. And this is a whole piece here, an allegory around justice and a cord that is being held by every single citizen of no matter what degree coming up to the city of Siena itself. And on the other side of the wall is the alternative. This is what you get: tyranny, war, destruction, chaos, instability, breakdown. And I am thinking about, what did we know once upon a time about the importance of helping ourselves as a species see, feel, and think simultaneously about our choices on a daily basis, enacted as a context in which we do things in cities? And I'm going to finish with a provocation. I spend my life working on radical collaboration. I spend my life instigating things to make this happen, leveling up, changing, trying to really shift the institutional structures of the way I work with others, we work with others, what it is that we do. We are in a context where, for one part of this world has decided to unleash a civilization war in the interests of winning control over AI. So as we think about resilience and cities desperately need digital twins and AI and will adopt them more and more, because there is no other way of really dealing with the intense complexity of that shape of change, we need to start thinking about what is the alternative that is able to hold ground and hold space, that is not simply a Luddite reaction. That is this particular initiative was launched actually extremely recently. I've been involved since I heard this, kind of went through this whole process about a month ago in mobilizing who do we know, how do we bring together those who are working on alternatives, how do we create that budget of possibilities, those futures that are not default. And it's interesting to see who is already showing up in support of them. That came through last week. So my invitation to us is to think, there is one story powerful enough to bring all of us together, no matter our differences. And that is a common home. One common home in one common place, played out into multiple places that we call our homes and our cities. If we are going to really face into the scale of the problem we face, at the order of the problem, in the context in which we are now, I think our conversations about resilience are going to need to have to go way deeper, way broader, way down and up. We are going to need to think about extraordinary forms of deep structural resilience of every single form: brain, society, community, infrastructure, institutions, finance, economy, everything. And my invitation is that we actually use that time that we have together here to really level up what we mean when we say resilience. I am going to stop there, and I'm going to pass over the baton. I suggest that you don't clap, because if we just make this one seamless set of presentations, then it'll feel a little bit less disjointed.